Hello. Today we're going to talk about a topic we all love, money. In particular, the real issue today is how does the interest rate get established in the economy? Remember what we talked about last week was how aggregate output is determined, and we assumed that prices were fixed, interest rate was fixed, and we have no inputs and outputs. And so today what we're going to do is start the series of lectures where we generalize each of those things. Today we're going to talk about how interest rates get established and then connect that back to the aggregate output next lecture. So today we're going to talk about interest rates. In a sense, the topic is deceptively simple. And I really mean deceptively meaningfully because it's quite subtle. It's much more complicated than it might seem. But at the very surface level, what we have is that the demand and supply of money determines the interest rate, in a sense like in any other market. The price of money is the interest rate, and there's a demand and supply for it, which determines that interest rate. And then monetary policy is the government manipulation of the supply of money so as to affect interest rates. So we're first going to talk about how interest rates are determined independent of the Fed, and then we're going to talk about how the federal government, the Federal Reserve Board, can manipulate the supply of money with the purpose of changing these interest rates. Okay, so the first question you should be asking yourself is, what is money? We use this term a lot. We use it in lots of different ways. But the way we're going to use it now is, money is funds that you can spend. So if you've saved money for numerous years, remember when we talked about in our previous lectures about you earn money and then you decide how much to spend and how much to save? Well, over the years, your savings build up and you've got this set of savings, this total amount of savings that you've accumulated over the years, and you get to decide what you want to do with that. You can either hold it in a form that allows you to spend it whenever you want, or if you've got enough of it, you might decide to loan it to somebody because that will allow you to earn some interest on it. And so instead of holding it in a liquid form, which means you can spend it whenever you want, that's what's called liquid assets, you can instead decide to loan it to somebody. You then no longer have access to that money until the loan's paid back. The other person has the money, and they can spend it, but you can't until the loan's paid back. But in return for your giving up that liquidity, that ability to spend the money yourself immediately, you get an interest rate for that. And the interest rate is the amount that you get for giving up your liquidity. If you haven't saved much and you want to buy something, like you want to buy a car or a house and it costs more than your entire savings, all your accumulated savings over the years, then you can borrow money. Essentially what's happening there is the reverse. Somebody else who saved money over the years is deciding to not keep their money, their funds in a liquid form, but rather to loan it to you. And you get to use it to buy whatever you're going to buy, and you pay them an interest rate. Okay? So essentially what's happening is, out of all the money that hasn't been spent, all the accumulated savings over the years, there's tons of it, enormous amounts of money that people have saved in the economy. Each person decides whether they want to have more liquid assets than they currently do or less liquid assets than they currently do. If they want more liquid assets, they borrow money. If you want less liquid assets, you loan out your money. So it's all a matter of how these transactions occur. You buy it, you're essentially determining how much money you want at any given time for you to be able to spend, and how much money you want to loan out to be able to earn interest on it. Now, the way I've just described it, it sounds like it's a dichotomous choice, that you either keep money in liquid form that you can spend immediately whenever you want, or you loan it out to somebody and you can't use it for that period. Like if you loan it to somebody for a mortgage for their house, you might not get it back for 30 years. And so it's kind of a discrete time. In reality, there's a huge continuum here. You actually get interest on funds that are fully liquid. If you have money in a bank account, how many of you get interest on your bank account? Yeah. You can spend that money anytime you want, and you're still earning interest. However, the concept there is still the same. What's happening is you've put money in the bank. The bank knows that everyone who's made deposits is not going to withdraw their money all at once, even though they all legally have the right to. Just from an expectational point of view, that won't happen. And so then the bank takes part of that deposit and loans it out to people. So you're indirectly loaning money through that. You haven't given up any liquidity. The bank is essentially aggregating all the different people's deposits and loaning out part of it, and then giving part of that interest rate back to the depositors as a way of attracting more deposits. So it's essentially happening. It's just happening at a deeper level. And of course, you don't get much interest on those bank accounts because you essentially get it. You have access to the money whenever you want. Which leads to this idea that there's a continuum of liquidity. Bank accounts, you can get the money whenever you want. If you buy a 26-week Treasury note, you get your money back in 26 weeks. If you do a mortgage, loan somebody money for a long-term mortgage, get it back in 30 years. There's a long, anything in between that also. So you can put your money in different forms of illiquidity. It doesn't have to be fully liquid or not liquid. It's different degrees of illiquidity depending on how long you have to wait to be able to get it back. And each one of these has its own interest rate. And so what happens is you get a continuum of interest rates that rise the more illiquid the assets are. This is why a 30-year mortgage costs more, has a higher interest rate than a 15-year mortgage. And a 15-year mortgage has a higher interest rate than a 5-year mortgage. Okay, so what I'm going today to ignore all this and pretend you either loan out your money or you don't. And you either loan out your funds or you don't. And there is an interest rate for that. In reality, what we're describing today occurs for every type of loan, every level of liquidity, and they all kind of move in lockstep up and down together. So the concepts are still relevant. It's just easier to talk about it in this particular way. So the interest rate is the premium you pay for lower liquidity. So now, why do people want to hold money? You've got all these accumulated savings that you've accumulated over the years. Why don't you just loan it all out? The reason you want to not loan out your money is because you want to use it. You might want to buy something. So there's two main reasons that people hold money. One, the most important one, and the one that's going to be crucial for how we examine the macroeconomy, is just for transactions. If you want to buy things, you have to have liquid assets to do it. If you want to buy a house and you haven't accumulated enough savings, you have to borrow money, which then you're taking somebody else's funds and paying them an interest rate for them, and it becomes now your liquid funds to have. And you're doing that because you want to buy a house. So it's the reason people want to hold liquid funds, money, is to make transactions. There's also a second purpose, and this we're not going to deal with much, but it can affect interest rates quite dramatically, is speculation. If people think interest rates are going to rise, you choose not to loan out your money now in hopes that later you'll get a higher interest rate. Or if you think interest rates are going down, you choose not to borrow money now in anticipation of hoping to get a lower interest rate when you borrow in the future. But the main thing that drives the relationship between interest rates and the macroeconomy is the transactions motive. People, you need money to buy things. Okay, so then we can think of money, that is liquid assets, funds that you can spend, as a good just like anything else. And there's a demand for the good. The price of the good is the interest rate. It's strange to think of the price as being the interest rate because to hold money, you don't, if you've got your accumulated savings and you decide not to loan it out, you're not really paying an interest rate for the funds that you decide to keep liquid. But you could have loaned it out, and so this is the opportunity cost of holding your funds in a liquid form. You could have loaned out your money for, say, 5%. The fact that you didn't means that you're giving up 5% interest to be able to hold your funds in a liquid form. Or if you're borrowing money, so you are obtaining more liquidity than your accumulated savings would have allowed you otherwise, then this is the cost of borrowing money and obtaining the liquid assets through that borrowing. So either way you want to look at it, it's still the cost of holding liquid funds. And just like with any other good, there's a downward sloping demand. If the interest rate is low, there's less opportunity cost to holding on to your funds in a liquid form. There's less incentive to loan them out, and so you won't loan them out as readily, and you'll hold more in a liquid form. And if you're thinking of borrowing, with a lower interest rate, it's cheaper to borrow, and so you might borrow more and obtain greater amount of liquid funds through borrowing from somebody else. When you're borrowing from someone else, somebody else is making the reverse decision of what you did. They're deciding to give up their liquidity and give it to you, and you're taking it and paying them an interest rate. So it's a transfer of liquidity from one person to another. When the interest rate is low, more people are going to want to borrow money or hold whatever funds they have in liquid form rather than loan them out. This is actually happening now. The bond rates today are so low that a lot of people are just holding money in cash rather than putting it into any investment vehicle because it's hardly worth it. So that's an example of people choosing now to, when interest rates are very low, to hold their funds, accumulated savings, in a liquid form. As the interest rate rises, of course, it becomes more expensive to borrow money, gain liquidity from somebody else, and the opportunity cost of keeping your own liquidity funds in a liquid form goes up because you could loan them out, get more money off of them. So the demand for money is downward sloping, just like you'd expect. Importantly, various things can affect the demand for money. If the size of the economy increases, if the overall income of people increases, then the demand for money is going to necessarily increase. That's because one of the main reasons for holding money is to buy things. And when your income goes up, you want to buy more. If you want to look at this in big terms, you're more likely to buy a car and have to borrow money for it or use up a lot of your savings for it when you're making a lot of money than when you're unemployed. So an increase in the aggregate output of the economy, which is aggregate income to consumers, increases the demand for money. Another one that has an effect, and we'll play through this after we allow prices to vary a week from today, is when prices change in the economy. If all prices rise, then you need to have more money available to buy the same goods that you were buying before. If a car costs $25,000 instead of $20,000, you got to have an extra $5,000 in cash, in money, to be able to buy the car. And so if prices rise or the aggregate level of the income in the economy rise, both of those cause the demand for money to rise. Now, this is the part in which this becomes, you start realizing this is not a simple demand and supply system. The supply for money is fixed. At any given amount at time, there is an amount of liquid assets in the economy. You could actually measure it by, in fact it is measured, by each of you take out your wallet, count up how much money you've got in it, and how much money you've got in a bank account where you have access to it that you could spend at any moment without any restrictions. And the sum of that over all people is the amount of supply of liquid assets, of money, in the economy. This seems a little strange because you would think the supply of money would be upward sloping with, in the same way you'd normally have it. But what this incorporates, and this is how this is not really like a microeconomic demand and supply system. It's important, it looks like it, but it's not really the same. The reason the supply is fixed is because any transaction from one person to another is simply mirrored through that other person. So if I loan you $10,000, I have 10,000 less liquid assets, but he's got 10,000 more liquid assets. The total amount of liquid assets in the economy hasn't changed. It's just a matter of who's holding it. So given that all that loans do is move around the liquid assets, who has them, they don't affect the amount of liquid assets that are out there. It just who has the right to spend that money. That's what this is essentially saying, is that there is some amount of money out there, liquid assets, and all that's going to happen by people deciding whether to borrow or loan money is who's going to get it. If you borrow money from someone, you're getting liquid assets, they're getting less liquid assets, and vice versa. So this is an aspect of the economy being closed, and the way in which this is very different from micro. Whenever we look at microeconomics and demand systems, there's always, you're looking at one good, and there's all these other goods that could be bought. It's not a closed system. That's not the only good in the economy. Here, money in the economy, all that can happen is it can change hands. And so the total amount has to be fixed. This is the extremely important concept. Okay, well then if you use that idea and interact demand and supply using your normal concepts of demand and supply, you'd get an intersection, which is the interest rate at which the amount of money we want to have is equal to the amount of money we actually do have. And that's the determination of the interest rate. Again, since this is not truly a demand and supply system in a micro sense, I want to go through again how do we get to this equilibrium and what it actually means. So we've done this in micro, but it's every time you see an equilibrium, you should move away from the equilibrium, see why that's not an equilibrium or what's happening. So suppose we have an interest rate up here. What that is saying is that this is the amount of liquid assets in the economy altogether. When everyone in the economy is deciding how much liquid assets they want to hold, do I want to loan out money? Do I want to borrow money? Whatever. The total amount that all of us combined want to hold of liquid assets is less than what we currently do. That means that there are a lot of people trying to get rid of liquid assets. They want to find someone to borrow their money. Here, I've got liquid assets. I want to earn interest on them instead of hold them in a liquid form. Please borrow from me. And there's more people who are looking for borrowers than there are borrowers available, because the amount that is the supply of liquid money is greater than what we actually want to hold. What will happen in that case? If you're a person wanting to loan out your money so as to get an interest rate, you will go to one of these people who is thinking of borrowing money at R1 and say, don't pay 4%, I'll loan it to you for 3%. And the price will go down. Essentially, we've got more people wanting to loan out money than we've got borrowers, and so the price of loans goes down. And that's what happens in that direction. Similarly, in the other direction, we have this opposite going on. Here, this is the amount of money that we actually have, but when we all decide how much we want to hold, we all in combination want to hold more than we actually are. So that means on net, there's more people wanting to borrow money to get liquid assets than wanting to loan money to get rid of their liquid assets. So given that lots of people now want to borrow money, what's going to happen? The people who want to borrow money are going to offer those who have liquid assets, loan to me and I'll pay you a higher interest rate than the going interest rate. And that'll push the interest rate back up. How is this different from a micro system? I think the key element, well, there's only one equilibrium in a demand and supply system with upward and downward demand and supply. So that's not it. Remember when we were talking in micro theory that whenever you have a demand and supply, it's the lower of the two that gets activated. It takes two to tango to make a transaction. And so if you were at a higher price, the transacted amount is here. At a lower price, it's here. It's off the supply curve. That's not true in this system. We always have this amount of money. That is the amount of money in the economy. This curve tells us what we want, not what we've got. And so it's not that at this interest rate, this is the amount of money that's transacted. This is the amount of money that's there. And what's happening is we want to hold less money than we've got. And so there's lots of people looking for people to borrow from them. Here, take my money, pay me interest. I'll offer you a low interest rate. And so we're always on this vertical line. That's another way in which this occurs within a closed system where, as an economy, there can be no change in the aggregate amount of money. All that happens is who's got it. So what this is doing is saying we're always on this line, and we're comparing it with what in aggregate would like to be. And when we're on this side of it here, that means in aggregate, we have more people wanting to loan money than borrow it. And down here, we've got more people wanting to borrow money than loan it. And so it doesn't equal out. So what happens then is the interest rate has to equilibrate this market. Now recall, before I go on, remember when we were talking last week about the aggregate economy? Did you in section go over the idea that aggregate output is determined where savings are equal to investment? I hope some people are nodding yes. Marquez, did you go over that? Well, his sections did. You should have been asking yourself, and I raised this in the lecture before, how come that equilibration occurs by changing aggregate output? How come saving doesn't equal investment by changing the interest rate? Why doesn't it? The problem is savings and investment are the funds that are saved and invested that year. This is the total amount that has been saved over all possible previous years compared to what we want to hold as being able to, borrow and save now. They're two completely different totals. This is the total amount of accumulated savings over all time, and how much do we as an aggregate want to hold of that amount in liquid terms, and who wants to hold liquid, who wants to hold illiquid form. Okay? That's a huge number. The amount from year to year is a very small number. If the interest rate equilibrates these big numbers, the total amount, accumulated savings, such that the amount that we actually hold is exactly what we want to hold, it can't also equilibrate savings and investment in a given year, because that's just a small fraction of the whole thing. So you can't have interest rates doing double duty. That's why the only thing that can equilibrate the market for aggregate output is a change in aggregate output. The interest rate has to do this. Now, we're going to see in next lecture that there is a feedback loop, but it's not going to be sufficient to equilibrate both markets. Essentially, you can't have interest rates solving both problems at once. Yeah?
So interest rates can't solve the problem when changing the aggregate output?
Essentially, you've got two equilibrations. The total amount, if you look at all the savings that have been accumulated by everyone over all time, there is an interest rate that makes everyone happy with the amount of that they've loaned out and that they've borrowed. There's also, in any given year, an amount that people save in that 1 year compared to the amount that they and firms invest in that 1 year. That's a totally different thing. There's no way the same interest rate can equilibrate both of them. So given that it can't equilibrate both of them, something has to shift. And the only thing left to shift is aggregate output. This is a very important point and very difficult to think about. So it's important. Okay, so now what changes the interest rate? If the money demand rises, then that causes interest rates to rise. That means that we've already seen if aggregate output increases or prices increase, that in itself, if there's no adjustment, causes the interest rate to rise. And if the supply of money rises, that causes interest rates to drop. So you have the same kind of thing as in a micro. It looks very much like a micro demand supply system. Increase in demand causes prices to go up. Increases in supply cause prices to go down. You should be asking yourself, well, if supply is fixed, how does it increase? And that's what we're going to talk about. So that brings us to monetary policy. Monetary policy is the explicit manipulation of the supply of money so as to affect the interest rate. In this case, if the monetary policy is geared to increasing the supply of money in ways that we're going to describe in just a few minutes, then it'll cause the interest rate to drop. And if the monetary policy is engendered to decrease the supply of money, it'll cause interest rates to rise. So the whole purpose of monetary policy is to change the supply of money, which then changes the interest rate. Next lecture, we're going to see how the change in interest rate affects aggregate output. But for now, we just want to talk about this. Okay, and then, so how is this actually done? The Federal Reserve Bank is essentially the bank of last resort. It's the banker's bank. We put money, you deposit your money in Wells Fargo or Bank of America or whatever. Those banks make their deposits, hold their assets, in the Federal Reserve Bank. Okay? You can borrow money from Bank of America, Wells Fargo. If you want to get a loan, you can go to one of them. And the banks can get a loan from the Federal Reserve Bank. So in a sense, you can think of it as just the banker's bank. But because it is the Federal Reserve Board, which governs the bank, can decide what to do with the assets that it holds, it can take several actions that affect the supply of money in the economy. So I'm going to just go over those one by one. First of all, banks are required, this started after the Great Depression. Remember in the Great Depression, one of the big problems was there was runs on the banks. People went to the bank to try to take out their deposits, and there wasn't any money there. And the banks just collapsed. And of course, that's a self-fulfilling thing, because if you're afraid, if you don't get to the bank quickly to get your money out, you're going to be one of the ones that don't get any at all. You're going to try to go sooner than everyone else. And then, of course, everyone's trying to go sooner, and you generate runs on banks. To mitigate this problem, the Federal Reserve Board established reserve requirements for banks to hold a portion of their assets, portion of the deposits, at the Federal Reserve Board. So if you deposit $1 to Bank of America then has to deposit some amount of money, say 10 cents, with the Federal Reserve Board bank. That way, it has at least that much money as a kind of cushion if a lot of people want to take out their money at once. Now, it doesn't deal with the fact if everyone wants to take out their money immediately, because it's not a required reserve ratio of 100. It's only a portion of it. And so it doesn't solve the problem, but it apparently gives enough confidence to everyone such that we don't now have runs on banks like we used to. But what happens there is the bank, when you make a deposit to Bank of America for $1, it has to make a deposit to the Federal Reserve Bank. The remainder of the money it can loan out. What's that? It loans it out and gives liquid funds to somebody. The amount that it gives to the Federal Reserve Board just sits there. It essentially has been taken out of the economy and is no longer money that can be used. No one can use it. So essentially, the money that's on deposit with the Federal Reserve Board through these it becomes illiquid assets without transferring to anyone. Remember that if I loan you money, I give up liquidity, you gain liquidity. But as soon as you put money in the Federal Reserve Bank, whoever puts it there loses the liquidity because it just sits there. Okay? What that means is that the Fed can change the amount of money that's available in the economy by changing the reserve ratio. If the if the reserve ratio is 20% at one point in time, and the Fed wants there to be more money in circulation, that is, the supply of money to be higher, they can reduce the required reserve ratio from 20% to 10%. Then half the money that was being held in the Fed that's just sitting there, nobody gets to use, half of that now goes back into the economy and gets to be used as liquid money. The banks can loan it out and people can spend it. So by changing the required reserve ratio, the Fed can change the amount of money that's available in the economy, the supply of money. That's the most tangible way to think about things. So there's more money in circulation when you lower the required reserve ratio, less when you raise the required ratio. Also, the Federal Reserve Board loans money to member banks at various rates. The cheapest one is the discount rate. It's an overnight rate. Of all the money that has been deposited at the Fed, they actually can loan out as much as they want to. Okay? That's another way in which the money that, if it were just sitting there, would be out of circulation, goes back into circulation. And when they loan out money, they loan it at an interest rate and then meet whatever demand there is for loans from the banks at that interest rate. So the discount rate is the rate that the Federal Reserve Bank charges the member banks to borrow from it. Okay? And if they lower the discount rate, then banks will borrow more money, and that puts money in circulation as opposed to having it sit at the Fed where it's not in circulation. So by lowering the interest rates, banks can borrow more money. They then loan it out at a higher interest rate and make a little profit off of it. And the money gets to be part of the liquid assets that are held in the economy. Again, the way to think about this is all the money that's deposited with the Fed essentially is out of circulation, so it's no longer part of the supply of money. And one way the Fed can adjust how much it's holding is to loan out more or less of it, of the amount that's deposited with it. So that's the second one. And then the third one is the one that's used most often. Remember, we've got all these treasury notes, bills, and bonds that you can buy. Have any of y'all bought? Raise your hand if you've bought a treasury note, bill, or bond. Yes, yes, yes. You can go on the website and do it. You know, you just go do it. What the Federal Reserve Board does is buys and sells those securities, those treasury notes, and in doing so affects the supply of money in the economy. This is actually a little hard to think of when you describe it, but if you actually see it happening, it's so vivid, it's easy to understand. So I wrote up a little thing here. This is a sheet of paper that says, the U.S. government will pay the holder of this note $110 on November 7th, 2012. That's 1 year from now, okay? So this is an IOU that says the government will pay this amount of money. The Fed has this piece of paper, and it can sell it to someone. Do you got any money on you? You got $100?
I don't think so.
Here, I'll give you $100. We can pretend this is your money. 1, 2, 3. Be sure and give it back to me. Okay, so he's got this cash sitting in his bank account, and I'm the Fed, and I go up to him and say, I will sell you this piece of paper that guarantees that the government will pay you $110 a year from now. Will you pay me $100 for this? You'd rather not? That's a great interest rate. So he's getting a piece of paper that gives him $110 in a year, and he's paid me $100, the Fed, $100. So the first thing is this $100 is no longer in circulation. Now we've just got a sheet of paper. That's not money. He's transferred liquidity from himself to me, the Federal Reserve Bank, and the Federal Reserve Bank now just sits on it, doesn't do anything with it. So that money is now out of circulation. That's the first thing. The second thing is that has established an interest rate. He's getting $110 a year from now for paying $100 now, which means he's getting 10% interest. Okay? So that way now the Fed has reduced the supply of money in the economy by taking money from a citizen and giving him a sheet of paper that says, I owe you. Now if the Fed wants to do the opposite, there's lots of these floating around. The Fed goes out and says, okay, you got that sheet of paper. How about if I pay you $100 for it? And you'll do it. And it reverses the process. Now the Fed owns this money, owns this sheet of paper, and the citizen has money, and there's circulation there. Now in reality, here, take this back. Suppose we didn't do that. He just bought that for $100, and if I go back and now want to buy it back, he's not going to sell it for $100 because he liked the 10% interest. So actually, if I'm the Fed, if I want to buy it back, I'm going to have to pay him a little extra. How much? $2 extra? Is that enough? So he is now getting $102 for something he purchased a minute ago for $100. And so he's happy. I've bought him out. I've overcome his reluctance to pay back because now he's getting enough money in return. Notice what happened there. Two things happened. Not only did it give money back in circulation, so there's now circulating money, but the interest rate has dropped. The interest rate now is, this cost $102 to get, $102 to get, and pays $110, so all you're getting is $8 in interest, which is slightly less than an 8% interest rate. It's 8 divided by 102. So by buying it, you change the price of the bond, which effectively changes the interest rate. And the more you buy, the demand for bonds go up, their price go up, the interest rate effectively goes down. And that's what the government's doing. Okay, can I have my money back? You can have that. Now, a couple of things. First of all, the Federal Reserve Board does not sell the Treasury note the first time around. The first time I sold it, I pretended I was the Federal Reserve Board and sold it. But actually, you don't need to worry about this, but the actual thing is the Treasury Department sells them the first time around. The Treasury Department sells all these securities, all these pieces of paper, as a way of financing our deficit. So the government, the Treasury Department, sells an IOU to a citizen and takes their money. Okay? That money doesn't go out of circulation because the government spends it then. The Treasury spends it to finance whatever goods and services are being bought by the government. But after it's out there in circulation, now the Fed can go and buy one, which then increases the supply of money in the economy. Or of all the ones that the Fed had bought in the past, it can sell some of them. Okay? So even though the initial one always starts with the Treasury, the Fed has tons of these around. It can buy and sell at any moment for lots of them. You can also sell it to another person if you get tired of holding it and want to have assets, liquid assets. But you might have to take a discount, which means a higher interest rate implicit. So this is called buying and selling money on the open market, buying and selling paper on the open market. And it's a little strange to read that when you're reading that the Fed is buying and selling paper on the open market. You'd think, what in the hell are they doing? That's exactly it. It's simply a piece of paper that says, I will pay you this at a future time. And by buying and selling it, they're moving money into circulation or out of circulation. Okay, so if they buy a security, if the Fed sells a security that's selling a piece of paper, that takes money out of circulation because the citizen gives money to the Fed, and that decreases the supply of money. Decreasing the supply of money raises the interest rate. And then if the Fed buys a security, it does the opposite. The Fed then has the sheet of paper, the citizen has the money, and there's more money in circulation. That lowers the interest rate. Okay, does all this make sense? Great. Come back next lecture, we'll talk about how this interacts with the macroeconomy of aggregate output.